Hello friends, for today's video we're going to be doing another new fantasy releases wrap up. So as always, I will have timestamps in the description bar down below for each of the books we talk about, and then I'll have purchase links in case you'd like to check any of them out. The three books we'll be chatting about today would be I'm Afraid You Have Dragons, Can't Spell Treason Without T, and When the Moon Hatched. I have very drastically different feelings across the board with these three books, and I think I'll start with the positive and end on the negative. I usually prefer to start with negative and end on a positive, but let's do the reverse this time around. So we'll start with I'm Afraid You Have Dragons. This is written by an author who's been writing fantasy for quite a while and is taking advantage of a certain writing technique that I think is going to be really wonderful to see for some readers and maybe might be a con for others. It's a particular decision that is not really used very often, and the way in which we tell the story and go between the characters, this way of doing it is not utilized. In fact, it's actually told to a lot of new writers to avoid this particular tactic, and that would be head hopping. And the reason I'm starting with this is it does play a role in so much of the rest of the story, even though you wouldn't think it when I describe it. In case you don't know what head hopping is, the way it works is typically in a story, if something is third person, which this book is, you have a certain character, let's say, that starts the chapter, and if you want to go to a different character, meaning it will say something like, let's say the character's name is Julie. It will say something like, Julie felt really concerned, or Julie felt scared, Julie thought this, and it will stay with Julie, and you'll really only know everything associated with Julie. You'll observe the world with Julie, you'll understand what Julie's feeling, and Julie does not know how other people are feeling, thus she might observe so-and-so looked this way, so-and-so's hand shook, that kind of thing, but you don't know for a fact what that other person is thinking or feeling. So the way head hopping works is instead of having a formal page break to indicate now we're with this character, or by just starting a new chapter to indicate that we're switching to someone else, it will just, without any indication, it'll just go to that character. The reason that this isn't utilized very often nowadays is because it can be kind of convoluted for the reader. It can be kind of like, wait a second, I was just with this person, and I guess I'm following this person now, I guess I'm observing the scene through this person's eyes. And obviously you can somewhat tie this to omniscient, as omniscient is something where you have this other being, in a sense, that is kind of able to give you a bird's eye view of everything, and thus they can tell you how every single person is feeling in a given scene. And that was much more common in classic fantasy, and it's strayed away from it for a number of reasons. Some people find that it's a lot, like I said, easier for the reader to determine what's even happening, but also because we've kind of shifted to a more personal connection with our characters as opposed to being told a tale. And this is why I wanted to start with this point about the book, is I do think this story felt more like I was being told a tale. And I actually kind of enjoyed that because it was different from what we see these days. I will say my preference is that more personal connection to the characters. And I did have a couple times where it was a bit of a whirlwind where I was like, oh, okay, and I had to adjust. But it wasn't the biggest deal because the story is not epic. It's pretty contained, and it felt very much like a fairy tale. So I didn't really mind that it did this. However, I think it's going to throw some readers off a bit, which isn't to say like, oh, you're going to be so confused because you're dumb. I don't mean it to sound like that. I mean, it's just we're so unaccustomed to seeing that these days. And if you are like me, where your preference tends to be that more personal connection, I could see this being something that irks you a little bit. But if you like the classic feeling and you miss that, and you like that idea of being told a story, then I think you're not going to mind this writing style at all. So now getting to what the story is even about. You are following a young man who it is within the family business to rid people of dragons. Dragons are ranging from being basically like rodents to being like things that can disrupt livestock to being things that can cause and wreak havoc on entire villages. So our main character is somebody who is very knowledgeable about dragons and how to be rid of them. However, they kind of hate their job because they feel bad for the dragons. They just want to do everything they can to rescue any dragon they can, but they also have to sometimes kill the dragons. And you really feel for them because it's such a predicament to be in, and you're kind of questioning like, well, why don't they leave this profession? And something I think the story does well is it shows you the reason why. It explains to you throughout the story why our character can't just leave this. And I think in a sense, metaphorically, what you can pull from this is there are so many times that in our own lives, we are forced to take part in things that we don't really care for, that we don't want to be a part of, but there are outside pressures that are forcing us to continue to be a part of these things. So that's one element to this. I also think there's another perspective that has some issues with their father, and their father has put onto them so much of basically what it means to be a man, I'll say. And it doesn't just have to be something related to men. It's just the idea of you are supposed to fulfill this particular image of who you're meant to be. And the way that can be so incredibly destructive when that goes against who you actually are. And so while there are some things that I think are going to be very personal to certain individuals that are going to feel really well represented for some individuals, I think a lot of people can relate to that feeling regardless. And on top of all of that, I think that when you have a character that so clearly doesn't fit within that role, and yet they're trying so hard to fit within it, they end up causing harm to other people. They don't mean to, but they do. And I think that that's really well executed and explored. And then you also see the ways in which we have class differences. So the story itself is very meandering, and it gets to a point where it just feels like the plot kind of goes in a lot of different directions, but I didn't mind because I did really appreciate its themes. It's never probably going to have been a favorite just because the way in which it's told. I do like to have a stronger connection to either the characters or, well, that's pretty much it. If I have a strong connection to the characters, that's gonna usually be it for me to care a lot. But I also can be really gripped by unique world building and artistic decisions and stories. And if you especially have a combination of those things, then I'm really on board. But I do really like what I personally got out of this story. I liked the fairy tale feeling. I liked its themes. And so I think for a lot of people, it has a good chance of being something that's appealing to you as well. It is also on the shorter side, which is nice because I don't think that this story needed to be longer. In fact, if anything, I think we could have trimmed some of it, but that's just because of the nature of how it kind of goes all over the place. Next up, we have Can't Spell Treason Without T. For some reason, I always want to say you can't spell tea without treason. And I might have said that in the past, and it doesn't make any sense. But regardless, that's irrelevant. So this story is about starting over, starting fresh, starting something new, taking that next step in your life. You are following a woman who was previously a guard. They were so devoted to their job and protecting this queen. But after a very harrowing experience, it's pretty obvious the queen couldn't care less about this individual. All they cared about was their loyalty and what they could bring to the table. And after having this experience, our character decides, you know what, I want to live life for myself. And that is the decision they make. And what that looks like is starting a new life with their girlfriend, who is somebody who is a magic user, and not just any magic user. They're kind of the most important magic user to the entire realm. So much of this story is very similar in a lot of ways to Legends and Lattes, as the goal for these two women is to not just start life anew with one another, but also to build a bookshop and to serve tea at this bookshop. If you've read Legends and Lattes, you can clearly see the similarities, the building of this place, the way they're making their new life and their new home within it, and they're getting to know people around town and building these relationships. It's precious and it's cute. The thing that I really ended up enjoying about this, despite its very clear similarities to Legends and Lattes, not saying it copied, it's just, it was a similar reading experience in that part of the plot, but what set it apart was the world building, which I honestly wasn't expecting. I think the author really intrigued me. I know there's going to be another book that comes out, and I'm really quite excited for that one, to be honest, as the world building was really interesting. The magic was really interesting. The dragons were really great to see, and I'm quite looking forward to what the next one has in store. There's not too much else I can say without just revealing the plot to you. Oh, but I do want to point out the couple in this is quite cute, and how they communicate with each other and how they work through things was nice to see. Also, it's not very often these days that you get couples who have been together, they're just entering a new phase in their lives and in their relationship, but they're already established, and there's no obnoxious, third act breakup type of thing, which was so nice to see. I gotta say, it was just cute. It was just so nice and cute to see a couple that had ways of communicating with each other. When they felt a certain way, they would articulate it. They knew how to go about articulating their feelings as they've worked through things in the past. They've learned from those things, and now they can build their relationship even more. And I thought that was so pleasant to see. Now getting into When the Moon Hatched. So this was just not for me. It really, that's the best way I can put it, because this, I think a lot of you know. I will let you know how I feel about it work. I will recommend things that didn't work for me, but I still am never happy about when I have to convey that something really was a miss, and this was the biggest miss for me in a long time. I picked this up because I am currently working on a video where I'm going through a lot of different fantasy romance works. I'm trying to find the ways in which they fulfill what a lot of fantasy romance readers are looking for, the way in which they fulfill what romance readers are looking for, and what fantasy readers are looking for. This one, to me, it's really going to appeal to the individuals who like a lot of the popular fantasy romance stories. If you're somebody who likes the idea of what feels like a Sarah J. Maas story, then this might work for you. If you like the way in which the dialogue is delivered, like what you see in Fourth Wing, then this might work for you. If you like the idea of world building that feels really, really cool and the ideas feel cool, but you don't need, I guess I could say, to be bogged down by the details. You don't really care too much about understanding how the political structures work. You don't care too much about getting all the details about the magic. What you care more about is that that's kind of an aesthetic that's kind of in the background, and you really want to see this star-crossed lovers sort of romance, this whirlwind romance, then this might work for you. Essentially nothing about this book worked for me, though. Unfortunately, I did not like the dialogue. It really was a little too, not just modern, but I found it to be a little juvenile. I wanted more from the world building because the concepts were so cool that I really wanted more from that. And I felt that the plot just kind of went in a lot of different directions. But I was talking about with I'm Afraid You Have Dragons that I didn't mind so much the plot going in a lot of different directions because the themes I thought were really well done. And plus it had that kind of bizarre fairy tale feel to it to some degree. And this one, it just kind of felt like the way in which we describe what a pantser is. So if you've never heard that term, it is kind of a funny term, but if you've never heard that term, there are plotters and pantsers in writing, and a lot of writers fall somewhere within the middle of this spectrum. And plotters are individuals who plot to the extreme detail before they even begin writing. They know, like, chapter by chapter. That's the extreme end of plotting. Pantsers are people who sit down and they just start writing and they see what comes out. And there's pros and cons, and you can't necessarily force writers to be one or the other. I think a lot of times writers they just find themselves inclined creatively toward one or the other. And I think pretty extreme examples of these two things, a lot of times you'll hear Sanderson talk about being quite an extreme plotter, whereas you'll see someone like Stephen King is considered to be more of a pantser. And when you're more of a plotter, the upsides is that you can really incorporate details from the beginning so that by the time you get to the end, your mind is blown by all the details that have been laid out the whole time, and you can really flesh everything out. The downside sometimes, though, is it can feel like everything is happening according to a plan, and that certain aspects of the story don't really feel organic and don't feel true to the nature of the characters, those sorts of things, because you've forced them into these boxes that as you breathe life into them, maybe they don't actually fit within, but you have to hold to this rigid plot. And then with pantsers, The biggest thing is that often the endings are, you're just like, what? They come out of nowhere. And sometimes things in general feel like they come out of nowhere because they kind of did. The author was writing, they got swept up in the scene, they really enjoyed it. But what you have to do when you're a pantser is you have to go back and you have to incorporate whatever you ended up with. You have to find ways to tie everything together. And so for me, the best way to describe this book is it felt kind of like a pantser wrote the story, which I'm not implying or trying to state for a fact that this is what the author does and this is her method by any means. But it felt like that, and then it felt like we didn't really tie back in the way I prefer and the way I like out of my stories. And so you might notice I have not really described a plot, and that's because a little bit I'm like, I don't know. Even after I read the book, I mean, I followed everything that happened. Hold on, I'm going to show you in my notes. Let me reach across over here. So I'm going to show you in my notes, because I might maybe do a dedicated review, because I have a lot of thoughts, but I'm going to find for you, when I was writing out plot points for this, the amount of things that I wrote down. Okay. So the plot starts on this page, and then it goes across these pages. That is, maybe don't look at what I wrote, but it goes across these, and these are like, this is the plot. And that's not the best for me. I actually do love a meandering story that is kind of plotless, but in order for that to really work for me, it has to be an extremely character-driven story, or it has to be a mix of things where you're getting introduced to all the characters because it's epic fantasy, and often epic fantasy doesn't necessarily have a plot unless it's a quest story, that sort of thing. But sometimes epic fantasy, you're just kind of like getting used to the world and you're getting to know the characters, and things build and build and build, and then everything starts to come together, and there's these battles, and then there's these backstabbing moments, and you're just like, oh my gosh, what? And then it's exciting to not know what's going to happen next. You don't know how the characters are going to respond to things. That works for me. But you're following primarily a single character named Rave. Rave is somebody who doesn't seem to have a firm grasp on her past, and her memories seem to not entirely be present. She is somebody who is currently just ridding the world of garbage people, and she's doing so at the request of, or the demands of, her, I'm going to call it, employer. And then there's an inciting incident, which I won't say because that would be a spoiler. And then she gets caught up with a man who smells good and who is handsome and also massive. And then from there, he has a dragon, and they have a lot of discussions about who she is and what her past was, and also she really wants revenge as a result of the inciting incident, and she doesn't want to unearth her past, but the nice smelling, handsome, massive man is like, no, I need you to unearth your past. That's the best plot I can give you, because that is kind of the plot. If you look at the synopsis on Goodreads, it will give you some additional information, but also it's pretty similar to what I just said. So, this really didn't work for me. It really didn't work for me. I recently did a video discussing reasons why a lot of books are starting to feel the same. This was the book that sparked that video. So maybe you are really actually thinking a lot of what I've said sounds great and you're looking forward to it, and that is your cup of tea. And if that's the case, that's great. It seems to be working for a lot of people, so I'm really happy that a lot of people are enjoying it. And also, it was originally self-published and it got picked up, so I'm happy for the author's success. It would seem that I think she's written a number of works, and I'm glad that all of that effort is, now we're seeing a lot of success, because I want people to have success in their writing. This just was not for me. It wasn't my my kind of fantasy story, but maybe it will be for you. So I hope that's the case. If this idea of a Sarah J. Maas like fantasy story seems like your thing, then there's a good chance you might enjoy it. But anyway, that's it for some new fantasy releases. I have a couple of other stories I've picked up recently, so I am hoping to do another new fantasy releases pretty soon. I'm going to be out of town a few times coming up, so it might be a bit before it comes up, but just know I'm like bursting at the seams to talk to you about some other works that I've picked up recently, but we'll get to that when we get to that. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.